There is a moment in the life of every great rock star when the world feels infinite, when stadiums fill just because you walk on stage, when the music you make turns ordinary nights into something people remember for the rest of their lives. Michael Hutchence knew that feeling better than almost anyone alive. He had stood before 74,000 people at Wembley Stadium, with his arms spread wide, his head thrown back, and the crowd screaming his name like a prayer. He had sold 50 million records. He had been called the last true rock god, the man who made every woman in the room feel like he was singing only to her. And then, one warm August night in 1992, on a quiet back street in Copenhagen, a taxi driver threw a single punch. Michael Hutchence fell backwards. His head hit the curb, and the man who had dazzled the world was never quite the same again. That is the story almost no one told for more than 20 years. Not his bandmates, not his management, not even the woman who was standing right there when it happened. The secret was kept quietly, tucked away behind the official story of a rock star who burned too bright and burned out. And while the silence held, the people who loved Michael Hutchence watched him change in ways they could not explain, descend into darkness they could not understand, and reach an ending that shook the world on the 22nd of November, 1997. This is the story of what really happened. Not just the death, but the long, invisible journey that led there. A journey that began on a bicycle, on a pizza run, on a back street in Denmark. To understand what was lost on that Copenhagen street, you have to understand what Michael Hutchence was before it. He was born in North Sydney on the 22nd of January, 1960, to a businessman father named Kelland and a makeup artist mother named Patricia. From the beginning, his life was shaped by movement. The family followed his father's work to Hong Kong when Michael was young, and he spent years there attending the Beacon Hill School in Kowloon Tong, becoming fluent in a world of different cultures, languages, and ways of being. He showed promise as a swimmer and developed a love for poetry that he kept close for the rest of his life. When the family returned to Sydney in 1972, 12-year-old Michael enrolled at Davidson High School.
On his first days there, he was being bullied in the schoolyard when a boy named Andrew Ferris stepped in and told the others to leave him alone. That act of kindness forged a friendship that would shape the history of rock music. Andrew played guitar. He had brothers who played drums and bass. He had ambition and vision. And now he had Michael, who had no instrument but a voice and a shelf full of poetry notebooks, and a quality that Andrew Ferris recognized immediately as something extraordinary. They called themselves the Ferris Brothers at first. They rehearsed in garages. They played their first show in August 1977. By 1979, they had changed their name to In Excess, and the journey toward everything had begun. Michael's parents divorced when he was 15, and for a time he lived in California with his mother and half-sister Tina, attending Hollywood High School alongside future film actors who were still just teenagers themselves. He soaked in the atmosphere of those movie sets his mother worked on, the mechanics of storytelling through performance, the difference between playing a role and becoming one. When he returned to Sydney, he brought something back with him that none of his bandmates could have taught him. He had been shaped by Hong Kong and Hollywood and Sydney. He had been everywhere, and it showed in every single thing he did on stage. By the mid-1980s, In Excess were the biggest thing in Australia. Then in 1987, they released Kick, and the world fell at their feet. The album sold more than 10 million copies worldwide. It produced 4 hit singles. It put Michael Hutchence on the cover of every magazine that mattered. He was 27 years old, and he was everywhere. He moved through the world with an ease that most rock stars never find. He had a baritone voice that could drop to a whisper or push through a full band without straining, and he moved on stage with a physicality that was impossible to look away from. Friends described him as joyful, curious, generous, and deeply emotional. He cooked elaborate meals for the people he loved. He read voraciously. He was sensitive in ways the rock star image never quite captured. Bono, who became one of his closest friends, would later say he was amazing and interesting before the tragedy came. Kylie Minogue, who fell in love with him in 1989, would say that he awakened her desire for things she had never imagined.
The whole world agreed on this. Michael Hutchence was something rare. There is footage from the Wembley concert of July of 1991 that captures something almost impossible to describe. It is not the sound, though the sound is extraordinary, and it is not the spectacle, though the spectacle of 74,000 people with their hands in the air in an English summer is considerable. It is his face. There is a moment early in the show where he looks out over the crowd, and his expression holds something that is not quite triumph and not quite joy, but is something more complicated than both of those things. Something that recognizes the strangeness and the fragility and the astonishing luck of standing where he is standing. He was 31 years old. He had grown up in Hong Kong and Hollywood and Sydney, and somewhere in between all of that had become the man that rooms shifted around when he walked in. He had a daughter he had not yet met. He had a Copenhagen street he had not yet cycled down. In that moment, in that light, with that crowd, none of what was coming had arrived yet. He was just a man at the top of his life, looking out. People who were there that night still talk about it. Not only about the performance, though the performance was everything it was supposed to be, but about the particular quality of his presence. He walked out without theatrics, and the room changed. That was what Helena had meant when she said he was intoxicatingly good on that stage. That was what Kylie had been reaching for when she said he awakened her desire for things she had never imagined. That was the thing that made Bono say he was amazing and interesting. The word interesting carrying a particular weight coming from a man who had spent decades at the center of the world himself. What Michael Hutchence had was not a product of training or management or the careful construction of a persona. It was simply him, offered directly to the world without a wall in the way, and the world had responded to it in the way that people respond to authenticity, which is to say with an overwhelming and sometimes frightening love. He would play that stage 4 times in his career. The last time was 1994, after Copenhagen. And then came Copenhagen. It was August of 1992. The summer was warm.
INXS had decided not to tour their new album, Welcome to Wherever You Are, a restless, adventurous record that the band were proud of, but that the mainstream had not fully embraced. Instead, they planned a promotional run through Europe and then back to the studio to record again. Michael used the break to visit his girlfriend in Copenhagen. Her name was Helena Christensen. She was 23 years old, a Danish supermodel who had appeared on the covers of Vogue and Harper's Bazaar and was one of the most recognizable faces in the world. They had met the previous year after Michael had quietly ended his relationship with Kylie Minogue, and the connection between them had been extraordinary from the beginning. Helena described him as her perfect match. Joyful, she said. Sweet, deep, and emotional. Kind, profound, and funny. Total mental and physical chemistry. She was, by every account, deeply happy with him. On the night of the incident, they had done something completely ordinary. They had gone out to get pizza. They were cycling home together down a quiet back street in the Danish capital, Michael weaving slightly on his bicycle with the easy contentment of a man who had nowhere to be and nothing to worry about. A local taxi drew up behind him. The driver found he could not pass. An argument started quickly, the way these things do in the small hours when patience runs thin. The driver got out of the cab, and then he threw a punch. Michael fell backwards. His head struck the curb with a force that Helena would describe in a voice still shaking decades later as the worst thing she had ever witnessed. He was unconscious on the ground, with blood coming from his mouth and his ear, and Helena stood there in the dark of a Copenhagen side street, believing with absolute certainty that the man she loved was dead. He was not dead, but what happened next would shape everything. They got to the hospital, and Michael woke up aggressive and confused. The staff tried to keep him there. He physically pushed them away. Helena described how he came home to her apartment and spent much of the night vomiting, how she brought him food and he pushed it away, how he almost became violent toward her. She begged him to return to the hospital. He refused completely. He was aggressively against it, she said. She was frightened in a way she had never been frightened of him before.
What none of them knew at the time, what the doctors apparently failed to communicate clearly enough, what would remain hidden from Michael's own family for more than 20 years, was the true extent of what had happened inside his skull. He had fractured it. The damage was significant. His frontal lobes had been affected. In the 1990s, almost nothing was publicly understood about traumatic brain injuries. about the profound and lasting changes they cause to personality, impulse control, emotional regulation, and mental health. There were no guidelines yet for managing severe head injuries of this kind. Doctors gave him what they could and sent him on his way. Nobody sat his family down and explained what a frontal lobe injury meant for the man they knew. Nobody told Michael either. Or if they did, he did not hear it, or could not hold it, or chose not to believe it. What he was told was this: the injury had destroyed virtually all of his sense of smell, and most of his sense of taste. For a man who loved cooking, who made elaborate meals as acts of love for his friends, who took deep sensory pleasure in the world around him, this was already devastating. But according to Helena, who watched his face in that hospital room when the news was delivered, there was one moment above all others that broke him. When they told him what he had lost, Michael Hutchence began to cry. And through the tears, he said the words that Helena would carry with her for the rest of her life. "When I have children," he said, "I will never be able to smell my baby." INXS went back on the road. The world kept turning, and Michael Hutchence went with it, because that was what you did. You pushed through. You performed. You gave the audiences what they had always given you, which was everything, and you hoped that the dark spaces inside would eventually fill back in. They did not. The changes were visible to everyone who knew him well, and invisible to everyone else. Gary Beers, the bass player who had been by his side since Davidson High School, said years later that Michael was never the same after the injury. He came back a different person, Beers told a television reporter. He was a dick, and it wasn't him. That was the thing. It wasn't the Michael we knew, and that was what was so surprising. His sister Pina saw it too. He would suddenly get angry and fly off the handle, she said. He was always a very easygoing guy, so it wasn't like him.
I just couldn't understand what was wrong with him. Back then, I just thought he was being a jerk. None of them made the connection. How could they? Traumatic brain injuries were not part of the public conversation in 1992. The neuroscience was there, but it had not yet filtered through to the people who needed it. Michael's family watched a man they loved become volatile, erratic, prone to rages that seemed to come from nowhere and vanish just as fast. They watched him crave danger in ways he never had before. They watched him reach for substances to manage a pain and a confusion that no one around him had the language to name. Meanwhile, the band recorded their 1993 album Full Moon Dirty Hearts, and the changes were already there in the studio. In one moment that those who witnessed it would never forget, Michael picked up Andrew Ferris's vintage acoustic guitar, a treasured instrument, and smashed it against the floor. Not in a moment of artistic expression, not in the rock and roll theater of destruction that some performers use as spectacle. Just for fun, the bandmate said, bewildered. Just because he felt like it. That was not the Michael they knew. The Michael they knew would never have done that. Andrew Ferris, the man who had stopped a bully in a schoolyard and changed the trajectory of both their lives by introducing Michael to music, said nothing in the moment. What could you say? The man who had destroyed the guitar was wearing Michael's face and Michael's clothes and standing in the room where Michael had always stood. But the quality that made Michael who he was, the gentleness beneath the charisma, the genuine warmth that made people feel seen when he turned his attention on them, was somewhere else. The frontal lobe damage that had been quietly rewiring his emotional architecture since that August night a year earlier was doing its invisible work, and nobody in that studio had the language for it because nobody knew it was happening. They finished the album. They toured. They kept going, because that was what INXS did, had always done, since the garages in Sydney and the first show in 1977. You kept going. You did not stop and say that something has happened to us that we do not understand, that the person at the center of this band is carrying something that is changing him and none of us know what it is. You put your head down and you played the music. The music was still good.
It was always good. Whatever the injury had done to his impulse control and his emotional regulation, it had not touched the voice, or at least not yet. He stood on stages and sang, and the sound was what it had always been. That particular baritone that people described as like a physical sensation, something that bypassed the ears and arrived directly somewhere deeper.
The world looked at Michael Hutchence in those years and saw a rock star navigating the difficult middle distance of a long career. What it could not see was the invisible damage, the slowly widening distance between who he had been and who he was becoming, the pharmaceutical chemistry he was reaching for to fill a gap he could not name. At the same time, his relationship with Helena was fracturing. She had watched the man she called her perfect match become someone she no longer fully recognized. She was young and frightened, and she did not know that what she was seeing was the symptom of damage that had been done to his brain on a quiet street 18 months earlier. She only knew that something had shifted in him that she could not reach or fix. They stayed together until 1995, longer than most people might have managed, but eventually she could not hold on. What Helena did next was something her silence made possible. She did not tell his family. She did not tell the band. She did not seek medical advice on his behalf, or press for the severity of his injury to be documented and shared with the people around him. Perhaps she was too young. Perhaps she did not fully understand what she had seen. Perhaps the events of that Copenhagen night were something she found easier to leave behind than to carry forward into every subsequent conversation about the man she had loved. Whatever the reason, Helena Christensen kept the full truth of what happened on that street to herself. For 22 years. His family would learn about it only in 2019, when Richard Lowenstein's documentary Mystify premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival, and Helena finally spoke. Michael's sister Tina said she was angry when she found out. She felt it had been Helena's duty to say something to them. There were awful stories about Michael after he died, Tina said, and for Helena not to tell them about the injury was wrong. She could have reached out. But by then, it was far too late for the truth to save anyone.
Back in the 1990s, Michael Hutchence was being prescribed Prozac. He was seeing a psychiatrist. He was taking a cocktail of medications to manage the pain and the confusion that the injury had left behind. His drug use was escalating, and the reasons for it were invisible to those around him because the root cause had never been properly explained to anyone. He was self-medicating something that had a name, that could have been treated, that neurologists and psychologists would later review and say unequivocally was implicated in everything that followed. The man who stood before 74,000 people at Wembley was still inside somewhere. The warmth, the curiosity, the love of cooking and poetry and the smell of rain after a storm. But accessing it was becoming harder. The frontal lobe damage had installed a stranger in the same body, and the stranger did not always know the difference between a dark thought and a permanent decision. Nobody told him that either. Before the injury, before the darkness, before any of what was coming, there had been Kylie. She was 21 years old when she walked backstage at an INXX concert in 1988, brought there by her then-boyfriend, the actor Jason Donovan, who had secured the best seats in the house and backstage passes as a treat. Jason would later describe it as one of the more painfully ironic decisions of his life, because the moment Michael Hutchence saw Kylie Minogue standing in that room, something happened in the air that everyone present apparently felt at the same time. Kylie was the biggest pop star in Australia. She had come from Neighbours, the soap opera that had made her a household face, and turned herself into a genuine international phenomenon. But she had always been the good girl, the clean one, the one that parents approved of. She wore her hair in careful curls and her image in careful wrapping, and the world knew exactly what it was getting when it saw Kylie Minogue. Michael was something else entirely. He was 29, already a global star with the kind of magnetic pull that no amount of money or management can manufacture. He moved through a room the way a current moves through water. He had been everywhere and done everything and read everything and tasted everything. And when he looked at Kylie across that backstage room, he saw something that fascinated him. Someone who had not yet begun. He apparently asked to kiss her that first night, and she said no. More than once. She had a boyfriend. She was careful. But the connection, as she would say years later, was instant. When her relationship with Jason ended in 1989, Michael was ready. They began something that Australia watched with the same incredulity it might have given to a fairy tale where the characters come from different stories. The good girl and the bad boy. The soap actress and the rock god. The girl who was everyone's friend, and the man who made every room feel like it was charged with electricity. What the public did not see was the tenderness of it.
The faxes he sent her constantly when they were apart. Sheets of handwriting that she kept in a folder and brought out decades later, still able to make her cry. The trips together on the Orient Express and through the south of France that she filmed on a home video camera. Footage so intimate that she sat on it for 30 years before finally sharing it with the documentary that was made about his life. The fact that he introduced her to books, music, food, the whole sensory architecture of a wider world, and that she would say quietly and without performance that she had probably been looking for something like that ever since and had never quite found it again. He awakened her desire for other things in my world, she said. He made me feel like I could be enough. In the end, it was the distances that unmade them. He was always on the road, always in a different city. The touring schedule of INXS in the early 90s was relentless, and the world was very large. And a relationship conducted largely through faxes and longing eventually became more longing than relationship. In 1991, Kylie flew from Japan to New York to end it. She found him on all fours on the floor, crying. She had never seen a man like that before. She left confounded and destroyed, knowing it was over, carrying a heartbreak that stayed with her, she said, for a very long time. A few months later, Michael met Helena Christensen. And then came Copenhagen. The woman he had sent all those faxes to, who had filmed him laughing on the Orient Express, who had sat beside him as he pointed out things in books she had never noticed, would attend his funeral 6 years later and feel something that no camera caught. Paula Yates had known Michael Hutchence since the 1980s.
She had interviewed him on The Tube, the Channel 4 music program she presented, and the chemistry between them had registered even then. But she was married. She was married to Bob Geldof, the Irish musician who had organized Live Aid, the charity concert that raised money for the Ethiopian famine, and who in doing so had become not merely famous, but sanctified. In the public imagination of Britain in the mid-1980s, Bob Geldof was practically a saint. He had a knighthood. He had the moral authority of a man who had put the world before himself. And Paula was his wife. It is worth understanding what that meant, because when Michael Hutchence and Paula Yates finally began their affair in 1995, they were not simply two famous people falling into each other. They were, in the eyes of the British press, a villain and a traitor. Michael was the Aussie ruffian, the phrase that appeared in tabloid headline after tabloid headline. Paula was the woman who had destroyed a saint's home, and the press came for them with everything they had. Paula had formally left Geldof in February of 1995. She and Michael had found each other at a point when both of them were in transition, when the certainties of their previous lives were crumbling, when the attraction between them had finally become impossible to resist. Tina, Michael's sister, would say years later that she found Paula to be quite unusual, that she would tell stories she knew not to be true, that she felt there was something wrong with her, and later came to believe it was a borderline personality condition. A friend of Michael's, and a fellow musician, told a documentary maker that in the last week of his life, Michael had actually been planning to end the relationship, that he had a plan in place to separate from Paula, and had confided this to someone close to him. We cannot know if that was true. We can only know what happened. What happened in the months that followed their union was a tabloid feeding frenzy of the kind that only the British press of the 1990s could produce. Michael had always had an easy relationship with journalists. He was charming, expansive, genuinely engaging company. He had found fame in Australia, where the culture treated its stars with a certain affectionate irreverence that never quite became cruelty. London was different.
London in the 90s was a city where tabloid editors understood that readers wanted someone to love and someone to hate, and Michael Hutchence had been handed the second role before he even understood what was happening. He would call his sister Tina from London, she said, and she could hear him weeping. "You have no idea what it is like here," he would tell her. I would say, "People here know you are a good guy." And he would say, "The press love a bad guy and a good guy. And I am up against Bob, Mr. Humanitarian. They said I ripped this family apart. That is ridiculous. Paula had moved out months before, but the label had stuck. He was the Aussie ruffian who had stolen the saint's wife, and every photograph of him in a British newspaper seemed designed to confirm it. The brain injury was deepening all of this. The frontal lobe damage that had been silently rewiring his emotional responses since that Copenhagen night was making the cruelty of the press coverage harder to absorb, the injustice of the narrative harder to endure. The man who had always managed to have his cake and eat it too, as he had once laughed to a journalist, was discovering that the cake had been taken from the table and replaced with something that tasted of nothing, because his sense of taste was gone, and the whole world seemed to be watching him chew it and calling him names. In July of 1996, Paula gave birth to their daughter. They named her Heavenly Hirani Tiger Lily for short. She was the most beautiful thing Michael had ever seen. His sister Tina would later describe watching him with his daughter as something unlike anything she had witnessed before. He was just crazy about her, Tina said. It was like nothing I'd ever seen. There was only one thing wrong with the picture. He could not smell her. He had fractured his skull on a Copenhagen curb 4 years earlier and lost the capacity to smell. And the one thing he had wept about in that Danish hospital room, the one fear he had given voice to in a moment of grief and honesty before the silence closed back around the truth, had come to pass. He could hold his daughter. He could hear her. He could watch her face in the morning light. But the specific grace of a newborn child, the smell that parents describe as unlike anything else in the world, the biological anchor that connects a parent to an infant in a way nothing else quite replicates, was gone from him.
Sealed off by a stranger's fist and a cold Copenhagen curb. 1997 was supposed to be a beginning. In Excess had a new album out, Elegantly Wasted, named after an old phrase that suited the mood of the band in the mid-90s rather better than anyone intended. They had planned a 20th anniversary tour of Australia for late November and December. The band were going back to where they had started, back to the places that had first loved them, back to the Australian audiences who had been there from the very beginning when they were 6 young men from Sydney with something to prove. Michael was rehearsing. He was in Sydney, away from London and the grinding hostility of the British press, in the city where he had grown up, and the air felt familiar and the food was good, even if he could not taste it. The plan was for Paula and all 4 daughters to join him in Australia. Tiger Lily was 16 months old. Michael had been separated from her for weeks by the requirements of touring, and the separation sat on him like weight. He had spoken to people close to him about how much he missed her. He had told friends he was frightened of losing her, that he could not stand a minute more without his baby. He was counting the days. Then Bob Geldof's lawyers moved. The mechanics of what happened are not complicated, but the human cost of them is. Geldof applied for and received a court injunction preventing Paula from taking their 3 daughters, Fifi, Peaches, and Pixie, out of the United Kingdom. Because Paula could not leave her other daughters behind, this meant she could not bring Tiger Lily either. Michael's daughter would not be coming to Sydney. The phone call Paula made to him in the early hours of the 22nd of November was the delivery of this news, and it arrived into a hotel room at the Ritz-Carlton in Double Bay, where Michael had been awake since well before dawn, drinking and talking with friends, running on no sleep and too much alcohol, and carrying a cumulative weight of damage and grief and pharmaceutical chemistry that had been building for 5 years. The coroner's report, released in February of 1998, after an inquest that lasted through the summer of the previous year, describes the state Michael Hutchence was in on the morning he died in careful and measured language. Severe depressed state, it says.
A number of factors, including the relationship with Paula Yates and the pressure of the ongoing dispute with Sir Robert Geldof, combined with the effects of the substances he had ingested at that time. What it does not mention, because no one had thought to bring it to the coroner's attention, because the information was locked inside Helena Christensen's silence and her determination not to revisit a Copenhagen night that had cost her the man she loved, was the frontal lobe damage, the fractured skull, the 5 years of neurological deterioration that had been stripping away Michael's capacity to regulate his own emotional responses, to step back from a dark thought and let it pass, to trust that what felt permanent in the worst hour of the morning would look different by noon. He had called his manager, Martha Troop's voicemail, at some point before the end.
The message he left her has been reported in the press. It is short, and it is raw, and it ends with him saying that he has had enough. He had called Michelle Bennett, the girlfriend he had been with for years in the 1980s, and left a message saying he needed to see her. She came to the hotel. She knocked on the door of room 524 and got no answer. She slipped a note under the door, the contents of which were never revealed. At 11:50 in the morning of the 22nd of November, 1997, a hotel maid entered room 524 to investigate why the guest had not appeared for his scheduled rehearsal. She found Michael Hutchence. The band who had been waiting for him at the rehearsal studio would never see him walk through that door. He was 37 years old. He had been carrying secret damage for 5 years. He had been fighting a battle that nobody around him understood, because the woman who had been standing on the street when the damage was done had kept the truth inside herself for reasons that remain her own. Outside the Ritz-Carlton, someone left flowers, then more flowers, then more. Within hours, the pile stretched along the footpath, and people were still coming, standing quietly, leaving things, the way people do when something enormous is gone from the world, and words are not quite enough. There was a moment in a television recording from the night of the 1996 Brit Awards that is painful to watch, even now, even with 30 years of distance between it and the present.
Michael Hutchence walks onto the stage of Earl's Court to present the award for Best British Video. He is 36 years old. He is wearing a dark suit, and he looks like what he is, which is one of the most compelling performers of his generation. He announces the winner. The band Oasis come to the stage to collect their award, and as they are leaving, Noel Gallagher turns back to the microphone and delivers a sentence that travels around the world within hours. Has-beens, Gallagher says, should not be presenting awards to gunnabes. The audience laughs. The cameras catch Michael's face for just a moment, and then the moment passes, and the evening moves on, and the whole thing is absorbed into the mythology of the 90s, filed under the general heading of Britpop swagger and Gallagher provocation, and the casual cruelty that was the decade's cultural currency. People forget about it. People who were not there move on. Michael did not move on. His friends would say later that the remark humiliated him in a way that cut deeper than a public insult normally might. He had always worried, beneath the confidence and the charisma, that the world saw him as a body and a voice, rather than a genuine artist. He had idols in people like Leonard Cohen and Nick Cave, serious writers who were taken seriously, who built reputations on the quality of their thought rather than the quality of their jawline. He had been fighting that perception for years, and now, on the largest stage in British music, in front of an audience of his peers, a younger man had reduced him to a punchline in 2 sentences. He went back to the studio and found the most direct response available to him. He added a background vocal to the title track of the album INXS were recording, a single spoken line buried in the music almost too quietly to hear, that said, "I am better than Oasis." It was the most Michael Hutchence response imaginable. Not a press conference, not a confrontation. A piece of music. An act of art. A private joke with the universe that he tucked into a record that hardly anyone bought, addressed to a man who would probably never hear it. Because the truth was that Elegantly Wasted, released in 1997, sold modestly. It was not the catastrophic failure that later mythology sometimes suggests, but it was not Kick. It was not Never Tear Us Apart reaching through a radio speaker and grabbing you by the throat.
The world had moved on to Britpop and grunge and the particular sound of the 90s, and INXS, for all their craft and resilience, were a band that belonged to a slightly earlier chapter. Michael knew this. He talked about it. He kept working, kept writing, kept trying to find the next thing. He had been building a solo album on the side since 1995, working with the Gang of Four guitarist Andy Gill, and later with the producer Danny Saber, laying down tracks at a home studio in the south of France and in London. It was serious work, ambitious work, the kind of album a man makes when he's trying to prove something to himself, rather than to a market. He had collaborated with Joe Strummer of The Clash. He had the outline of a duet with Bono. He was proud of it, genuinely excited about it, telling people he would finish it after the Australian tour and release it in the new year. He never finished it. After his death, Andy Gill and Danny Saber completed the album from what he had left behind, and Bono wrote and recorded the additional verse for the unfinished duet, a song called Slide Away,
the words capturing something of a friendship and a grief that no amount of craft can fully contain. The album was released in December of 1999, 2 years after Michael was gone, and dedicated with a single word to a child who would never read it: Tiger. The critics who reviewed it were generous. Some called it the strongest artistic statement of his career. A mature and intense record, one wrote, ranging from funky, upbeat tracks through to ballads with pleading vocals. It was, by all accounts, the album of a man who was not a has-been, a man who was, in fact, just beginning. He never got to know that. Imagine the weight of it. Not just the night of the 21st of November, 1997, but the accumulation of everything that had brought him to it. 5 years of neurological damage that nobody around him understood, that had been quietly altering the wiring between his emotions and his judgment, making the distance between a dark feeling and a permanent decision shorter than it had ever been before. 2 years of being the villain in a tabloid story that cast him as a ruffian stealing a saint's wife. The press of the world's most voracious newspaper culture deciding daily that he was the bad man in a morality play he had never auditioned for.
A relationship with a woman his closest friends believed was damaging him, who his own bandmates saw drawing something out of him they could not name but recognized as destructive. A daughter, 16 months old, for whom he had felt from the first moment a love so consuming that nothing in his experience of the world had prepared him for it, who was on the other side of the planet and getting further away. He had dinner with his father that evening at a restaurant called The Taste of India in Edgecliff, a short drive from the hotel. The restaurant manager would later describe the mood as warm and relaxed. He was charming with the staff, playful, the version of Michael Hutchence that had always been the true one underneath everything. He barely ate, smoking cigarettes through the meal instead. But at one point he sprang from his chair and pressed a spontaneous kiss on the lips of the assistant manager, who was reportedly charmed rather than startled. His father put his hand over his son's at some point during the dinner. He asked if everything was all right. Michael said he was fine. After dinner, his father drove him back to the Ritz-Carlton, and they said goodbye. It was the last time his father saw him alive. He spent the rest of the night in his hotel suite with 2 old friends, a former girlfriend named Kim Wilson and her partner Andrew Raymond, who had come to keep him company. They drank. They talked. By all accounts, the mood was elevated but pensive. Michael focused on the custody situation, on the children, on the distance between himself and Tiger Lily. Kim would say later that nothing in those hours suggested what was coming. They left at approximately 5 in the morning. What happened after that, in the hours between 5 in the morning and the phone call from Paula Yates that arrived with the news about the court injunction, we can only reconstruct from the evidence and from the particular quality of the silence that follows a very bad night. He was alone for the first time in hours in a hotel room on the 5th floor of the Ritz-Carlton, in the city where he had grown up, with the Sydney harbor somewhere out in the darkness beyond the curtains and the smell of the night air coming through, though he could not smell it. He could not smell anything. He had not been able to smell anything for 5 years, since a curb in Copenhagen had taken that from him. He could not smell the salt in the harbor air, or the particular sharpness of a Sydney summer night, or the ghost of the gardenias his mother had grown in the garden of the house in Belrose, where he had come home as a 12-year-old from Hong Kong and met a boy who would become his closest musical friend. None of it available to him. The world delivered through the surviving senses, flattened and incomplete, like a song missing its bass. He called his manager. He called an old girlfriend. He waited. Paula's call came with the weight of everything that had built toward it. The injunction, the custody hearing pushed back, the daughters who could not travel, Tiger Lily, 16 months old, who would not be coming. He had been counting days toward seeing her. He had told people he was frightened and could not stand a minute more without his baby. And now the calculation had changed, and the new version of events stretched out ahead of him in the gray light of a Sydney morning, and the substances still in his system lowered the walls between what he was feeling and what he could endure, and the frontal lobe damage made the distance between a dark thought and a permanent decision shorter than it had ever been in the man he used to be. The toxicology report prepared after his death found cocaine, Prozac, traces of Valium and codeine, and a blood alcohol level that was more than double the legal driving limit in Australia.
The quinine traces suggested he had been drinking gin and tonic. He had been prescribed Prozac in December of 1995 and had been taking it on and off ever since, adjusting his own doses according to how he felt rather than the prescription, in the way that people do when they are managing something too large and too private to share. 3 weeks before his death, he had collected his last prescription. His London psychiatrist, a man named Mark Collins, who had seen him just 5 weeks before the end, would later say there had been no hint of suicidal thinking in their last consultation. Minor depression was how Collins described it. Nothing that flagged what was coming. What Collins did not know, what nobody treating Michael Hutchence had ever been told, was about the fractured skull in Copenhagen and the frontal lobe damage that had been quietly degrading his capacity to regulate his emotional responses for the past 5 years.
When neurologists and psychologists were later shown the unedited coroner's report, in the period after Helena Christensen finally broke her silence in 2019, their assessment was unequivocal. The brain injury, they said, was consistent with what they called a perfect storm of suicide risk. A man whose ability to step back from the worst moment and trust that it would pass had been neurologically compromised, placed under sustained and extreme stress, given a combination of substances that lowered inhibition and intensified despair, and then handed a piece of news, in the darkest hour of a sleepless night, that told him the one thing he had been holding on to was not coming. Paula called. He could not see Tiger Lily. Geldof's lawyers had moved. The visit was not happening. What he did after that call is documented in the phone records that became part of the inquest. He called his manager, Martha Troop's voicemail, and left a message. The full content of that message has never been made public in its entirety, but the ending has been reported widely enough that it has become part of the record. He told her he had had enough. He was crying. He called Michelle Bennett, the woman he had been with for years in the 1980s, the one he had first reached out to after his all-nighter with friends. He was in a state of distress. She went to the hotel. She knocked on the door of room 524. There was no answer. There is a question that sits at the center of all of this, and it is not comfortable to ask, but it is the question that Michael's family have been asking ever since the truth finally came out in 2019. If Helena Christensen had told people what she witnessed on that Copenhagen street in 1992, would any of what followed have been different? It is not a question with a clean answer. Brain injuries of the kind Michael sustained do not come with a guarantee that disclosure leads to recovery. The 1990s were not an era of sophisticated neurological support for celebrities, and even if every person around him had understood what had happened to his frontal lobes, the depression might still have come. The substance use might still have escalated. The relationship with Paula might still have turned corrosive, and Bob Geldof might still have obtained that court injunction on the 22nd of November. And this is the but that Michael's sister Tina has been living with for years. But the doctors treating him for depression did not know about the brain injury. The psychiatrist who saw him 5 weeks before his death and found only minor depression did not know about the brain injury. The coroner who ruled on his death did not know about the brain injury. The people around him, who watched him become volatile and erratic and impossible to reach, who thought he was being a jerk, as Tina put it so honestly, who did not understand why the gentle, curious, generous man they had known seemed to have been replaced by a stranger, did not know about the brain injury. Knowledge shapes treatment. Knowledge shapes understanding. Knowledge shapes the way people respond to someone who is struggling, the degree to which they push for help rather than pull away in frustration, the language they use, the patience they extend. And the knowledge that Michael had suffered significant frontal lobe damage in Copenhagen was withheld from everyone who might have used it to help him by the only person who had been present when it happened for more than 2 decades. Helena Christensen has never fully explained why she stayed silent for so long. In the documentary Mystify, she spoke with obvious pain and obvious grief, and nothing in her account of those years suggests that she acted from anything other than the complicated silence that people sometimes fall into around trauma they have witnessed and could not prevent. She was 23 when it happened. She watched a man she loved fall unconscious in the street, with blood coming from his mouth and his ear. She brought him to hospital and watched him push the doctors away. She carried that night through 4 years of a relationship that was slowly undone by what it had done to him,
And then she carried it for 22 more years, in the particular way that people carry things they have no framework for putting down. Tina Hutchence understood all of that, and she was still angry. There were awful stories told about Michael after he died, she said. Stories about what kind of man he was in those final years, about the rage and the volatility and the erratic behavior that his friends and bandmates had witnessed and tried to account for. Stories that painted a picture of a rock star who had simply lost himself to excess and chaos and the corrupting weight of fame.
Stories that put the blame on Michael himself for what happened to Michael, without knowing that the explanation for most of it had been sitting in Copenhagen since August of 1992. The world made Michael Hutchence into a cliché in the days after his death. The headline wrote itself, "Rock Star Found Dead in Hotel Room." It was the story that fit, the story that required no uncomfortable questions about brain injuries or withheld information, or the particular cruelty of a media culture that had spent 2 years calling a man a ruffian for falling in love with the wrong woman. The official verdict was suicide while severely depressed, and the substances in his blood gave everyone a tidy explanation, and the full truth about the fractured skull and the frontal lobe damage was still 14 years away from being spoken aloud in public. Bono said at some point after Michael was gone that he was amazing and interesting, and then tragic. That they were all realizing just how great a singer they had lost, as well as a friend. It was a generous and human tribute from a man who had actually known him, who had spent holidays with him in the south of France and sat beside him in bars and watched the light in him, and who would later stand in a recording studio and sing the unfinished verse of a song called Slide Away on behalf of a dead friend, trying to find words that might do justice to what he had been. What he had been. What he had still been becoming, right up to the end. The solo album he left behind, completed by his collaborators from the fragments he had laid down, was dedicated to Tiger. Not to his legacy, not to the music, to a 16-month-old girl who would grow up with his name and without his smell, knowing him only through recordings and photographs and the testimonies of people who had loved him. Raised by the man who had, according to some accounts, helped set the circumstances of that final morning in motion, and who would nonetheless do something that nobody could have predicted: raise her well. Tiger Lily Hutchence Geldof grew up. She stayed out of the spotlight, mostly, in the way that Bob Geldof had reportedly wanted, trying to give her something as far from the toxic limelight as he possibly could. She got married in 2024 to a man named Ben Archer in a restaurant in East London. 30 guests, low-key and private. Nick Cave, her godfather, was there. Her sisters were there. Bob Geldof was there. She was expecting a child. Her father's fortune never reached her. But she was alive. She was loved. She was standing in a room full of people who had chosen to be there. It is the smallest possible comfort, placed against the size of everything that was lost. But it is the one that endures. When Michael Hutchence died, the world grieved in the way that it grieves for rock stars, loudly and briefly, and then not quite enough. The newspapers ran their headlines. The radio stations played Need You Tonight and Never Tear Us Apart on heavy rotation for a week. People stood outside the Ritz-Carlton and left flowers on the pavement. And then the news cycle moved on, the way it always does, to the next thing and the next thing after that. But for the people closest to him, the world did not move on. It fractured and kept fracturing in ways that no one had anticipated and no one could stop. Paula Yates did not recover from the loss of Michael. This was not simply grief, though the grief was enormous and real. It was something more destabilizing than that. She had built the last chapter of her life around him, had sacrificed a marriage and a reputation and the goodwill of a country that had once found her charming. And then he was gone, in a hotel room in Sydney on a November morning. And she was left in London with 4 daughters, 3 of whom were in the middle of a custody battle with her former husband, and a version of herself that she no longer recognized. She refused publicly to accept the coroner's verdict of suicide. In an interview on the program 60 Minutes in 1998,
She said with absolute conviction that she did not believe Michael had chosen to leave. "I cannot accept the verdict," she said. "I will not have my child grow up thinking that her father left her, not knowing the way he loved her." It was a mother's statement, as much as it was a grieving partner's, an attempt to protect a 4-year-old girl from the weight of a word that would follow her forever. In April of 1998, less than 5 months after Michael's death, Paula was admitted to a psychiatric hospital for treatment for depression. 2 months after that, she attempted to take her own life. She survived, but lost custody of her 3 older daughters to Bob Geldof, who had been awarded the right to raise them in the stable household he shared with his French partner.
By September of 2000, 3 years after Michael was gone, Paula was living in a house in Notting Hill that friends described as descending toward chaos. The years between Michael's death and her own were not quiet years. They were the years in which the person Paula Yates had built herself to be, the sharp and funny television presenter who had interviewed every rock star worth interviewing and raised 3 daughters and been the wife of the most morally serious man in British popular music, gradually ceased to function. She had staked everything on Michael. She had walked away from a marriage and a reputation and the goodwill of an entire country, and in return, she had had 2 years of love and a daughter who was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. And then, one morning in November of 1997, the phone had rung, and everything had been taken back. She fought the coroner's verdict because fighting it was the only way she could stay connected to the version of events in which Michael had not chosen to leave. She appeared on television and said she would not have her child grow up believing her father had abandoned her. She hired lawyers. She sent letters. She gave interviews in which her grief was so raw and so public that people who watched them felt they were witnessing something they should not be seeing, something too private for a screen. In the spring of 1998, she was hospitalized. In the summer, she was nearly lost entirely. Bob Geldof, the man she had left and whose daughters she had taken into the new life she was building, became the person responsible for those daughters again, and for Tiger Lily too, in the years that followed. It was not a simple story. Nothing in this family had ever been simple. But he did what was needed, and the children grew up. Paula did not grow up. She stayed at 38, then 39, then 40, locked in the year 1997, the way some people are locked in accidents. Her friends tried. There was not much anyone could do. The heroin was available, and the grief was large, and the intersection of the two was predictable in the way that the most painful things often are, which is to say that everyone could see it coming except the person at the center of it. She was 41 years old. On the 17th of the month, which was her daughter Pixie's 10th birthday, a friend came to check on her. The 4-year-old Tiger Lily was in the house. Paula was found dead. The official verdict was accidental heroin overdose. Tiger Lily was 4 years old, and both her parents were gone. Bob Geldof adopted her. He brought her into his household alongside Fifi and Peaches and Pixie, and raised her there, doing by most accounts something he had not been expected to do at all, which was a genuinely good job. He shielded her from the press. He gave her sisters. He gave her, insofar as it was possible, a childhood. A friend who knew him said he had wanted to do Paula the honor of bringing Tiger up as far from the toxic limelight as he possibly could, and he did. But the tragedy around that family had not finished. 14 years after Paula's death, on the 7th of April of 2014, Peaches Geldof was found dead at her home in Kent. She was 25 years old. Her husband had come home and found her. Her 11-month-old son Phaedra was in the house. The coroner ruled it a heroin overdose. The day before she died, Peaches had posted on Instagram a photograph of herself as a small child, curled against her mother. The coroner at her inquest said something that stopped people cold. He said that it was being described as history repeating itself, but that this was not entirely so. He acknowledged the achievement of the months she had spent free of heroin, the treatment and counseling, the effort and the love. And then he said quietly that for reasons they would never know, she had returned to it. 3 deaths. Michael in 1997, Paula in 2000, Peaches in 2014. All of them connected by a chain of love and loss and grief that began, by one reading of events, on a back street in Copenhagen,
on a warm August night, when a man fell backwards and hit his head on the curb, and a woman standing nearby believed for one terrible moment that he was dead. He was not dead, but the silence that came after was. In the summer of 2019, a documentary called Mystify, Michael Hutchence, premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival in New York. It had been 10 years in the making. Its director was Richard Lowenstein, who had known Michael since the 1980s, who had directed the Dogs in Space film he appeared in, and made some of the most iconic INXX music videos, and who had been sitting with the grief of his friend's death for more than 20 years before he finally found the shape of the story he wanted to tell.
The film was made without narration, without the conventional architecture of a music documentary. Instead, it was built from private footage, home movies, the kind of images that people accumulate through years of genuine intimacy, rather than professional documentation. Kylie Minogue handed over the Orient Express footage and the folder of faded faxes. Helena Christensen agreed to speak on camera for the first time in 2 decades. Bono spoke. Gary Beers spoke. Tina and Rhett spoke. Tiger Lily, who was now 23, sent an email to the band's management, and within 24 hours had cleared the rights to the INXX songs it needed. And then, Helena said the thing she had not said for 22 years. She had been there. She had watched him fall. She had stood on a Copenhagen street at night with blood coming from her lover's mouth and ear and thought he was dead. She had brought him to hospital and watched him push the doctors away. She had watched him return from that night as someone slightly different from the person who had left her apartment, and then watched him become more different as the months and years passed. And she had stayed silent about all of it, because silence was what she had, and she was young, and the injury was something she had not fully understood. And eventually she had let Michael go, and then let the night go, and kept it inside herself until a filmmaker asked her to bring it out. When the documentary screened, the neurologists and psychologists who reviewed the coroner's report in light of this new information were, according to Richard Lowenstein, unequivocal in their assessment. The frontal lobe damage, they said, created what one described as a perfect storm of suicide risk. A man whose neurological capacity for emotional regulation had been compromised, placed under sustained extreme stress over several years, given a mixture of substances that intensified despair and lowered inhibition, and then handed a piece of devastating news in a sleepless and chemically altered night. The coroner who had ruled on Michael's death in 1998 had never known about the brain injury. Nobody had told him. The doctors treating Michael for depression had never known. Nobody had told them either. A psychiatrist who saw him 5 weeks before the end had found only minor depression, had noted no hint of suicidal thinking. He was working without the most important piece of information there was.
Tina Hutchence said she was angry. She used that word specifically and deliberately. She felt it had been Helena's duty to say something to the family. There were awful stories about Michael after he died, she said. Stories that cast him as a man who had lost himself to the excesses of fame, who had become difficult and volatile and unreachable, who had in some way been complicit in his own unraveling. Stories that nobody told with the full information, because the full information was locked inside one woman's silence. Helena Christensen has said in the years since the documentary that she was not fully aware at the time of how severe the injury was, that she understood he had been hurt, but not the depth of what the doctors had found, not the significance of what the frontal lobe damage meant for who he would become, that she was 23 and frightened, and that the events of that night were something she carried without a framework for putting them down. All of that may be true. Human beings are not simple. Trauma is not simple. The reasons people stay silent about the things they witness are rarely simple. And Helena Christensen loved Michael Hutchence, genuinely and deeply. And watching him become someone she did not recognize, and then losing him entirely, and then carrying the knowledge of what she had seen on a dark Copenhagen street for more than 20 years, was not nothing. It was a long and heavy thing to carry, and it came 22 years too late to save anyone. There is music. That is the first thing to say, and in some ways the most important. It was always going to outlast the tabloid stories and the legal battles and the long, unhappy argument about who was responsible for what. Music has a way of surviving the things that surround it, of arriving in people's ears decades after the circumstances of its creation have been forgotten or rewritten or buried under other stories, and asking to be heard on its own terms. INXS have sold more than 75 million records worldwide.
The number keeps growing. There are people listening to Need You Tonight today who were not born when Michael Hutchence died, who know nothing of Copenhagen or Paula Yates or the Paradise Papers, who simply hear a voice and a guitar figure and feel something happen in the room. That is what he was. That is what he left.
Not the tragedy, which is the thing that the official story tends to reach for first. The rock star who burned out at 37 in a hotel room. The tabloid shorthand that reduces a complicated human life to a single sentence. The music. The specific quality of his voice on Never Tear Us Apart. The way it breaks slightly on certain syllables in a manner that sounds accidental but is not. That took years of performing to arrive at. The stage presence that people who saw him live describe in terms that are more usually used for natural phenomena than for performances, as something that simply happened in a space when he walked into it. The generosity of a performer who always seemed to be singing directly to you and no one else. There is music. That is the first thing to say, and in some ways the most important. Because the rest of it, the tragedy and the silence and the legal battles over money that never reached the people it was meant to reach, is what happened around Michael Hutchence. The music is what he was. Need You Tonight on a radio in 1987, that opening guitar figure, 3 seconds long, before his voice comes in low and direct and impossibly intimate. Never Tear Us Apart, the saxophone and the particular quality of yearning and the way he sustains the vowels. Mystify, which gave the documentary its name, because it described what he did to every room he walked into. Devil Inside, New Sensation, the albums and the tours and the 74,000 people at Wembley with their hands in the air, all of it lit by the presence of a man who had something that was genuinely, irreducibly rare. And then the solo album, released 2 years after he was gone, dedicated to a single word: Tiger. The album that Andy Gill and Danny Saber finished from what he had left behind, that Bono completed the final track of, that Tina and Rhett and the people who had loved him listened to when it came out, and heard their friend and their brother in the music, doing what he had always done, which was reaching through a speaker and making you feel that you were the only person in the room. Richard Lowenstein, who had been his friend and his collaborator and who spent 10 years making a film about him, said something that stayed with people. He said he wished he had told Michael to stop performing, just for a moment. Just sit down and talk to me about who you are, he said, and where your life went, what went right and what went wrong.
He said that making the documentary had surfaced regrets about misunderstandings and missed moments with a friend who was gone. That is the particular grief of survivors, the things you would have said if you had known there was a last conversation coming. Bono said he was amazing and interesting, and then tragic, and that they were all realizing just how great a singer they had lost, as well as a friend. The word tragic is correct, but it carries the wrong weight here, because tragic implies a flaw, an internal failing, something that was always going to lead where it led. And what the Copenhagen story reveals, what Helena's 22 years of silence concealed, is that Michael Hutchence's ending was not solely the product of who he was. It was the product of something that was done to him, on a street he did not choose to be on, by a stranger whose name nobody remembers, on an August night when he was just a man going home with a pizza. He was a man who loved cooking elaborate meals for the people he loved, until the injury took his sense of taste and smell, and made every meal an act of faith rather than pleasure. He was a man who kept poetry notebooks and read voraciously, and sat with friends in the south of France discussing books and music and the texture of being alive. He was a man who fell on all fours on the floor of a New York hotel room when the woman he loved came to end their relationship, and wept without shame, the way people weep when the grief is real and the walls are down. He was a man who held his daughter for the first time and said the most heartbreaking sentence: "I cannot smell my own baby." He was 37 years old. He had a solo album almost finished. He was planning to put a band together in Los Angeles in the new year and play some club shows and see what the music felt like without a machine around it. He had things to do. Tiger Lily Hutchence Geldof was married in 2024. She was 28 years old. The wedding was in a restaurant on Columbia Road in East London, about 30 guests, low-key and private, exactly the opposite of everything that had surrounded the story she had been born into. Her sisters were there. Bob Geldof was there. Nick Cave, her godfather, was there.
She was expecting a child. She had never, according to Richard Lowenstein, who went to visit her while making the documentary, received a single penny from her father's estate.
She had been promised the equivalent of 75 million Australian dollars in 3 installments at 18 and 21 and 25. She had received none of it. The business manager who had walked into the Rose Bay police station 2 days after her father's death and collected his personal effects had become, through a web of offshore trusts and legal structures that nobody had ever fully untangled, the person controlling the music and the image and the money that should have been hers. When she turned 21 and went to meet him, the interaction was, she said, so bad that she never went back. She told Lowenstein she had literally never received anything from anyone. He described going to her flat and finding it like a small squat. She kept her father's name anyway, Tiger Lily Hutchence Geldof, both names. The father she lost at 16 months and the man who raised her. Carrying both of them into a restaurant on Columbia Road in East London on a wedding day in 2024, with a child growing inside her, standing in a room full of people who had chosen to be there. Michael Hutchence wrote the lyric, "We could live for 1,000 years." He was 37 when he ran out of time to test it. The music has been running for nearly 30 years since he left, and it shows no sign of stopping. There is something his sister Tina said in an interview that cuts through everything else, through all the legal battles and the tabloid mythology and the long argument about what really happened in room 524, and lands somewhere true. She was talking about the moment in the hospital in Copenhagen when the doctors told Michael what the injury had cost him, and he broke down crying. And through the tears, he said the words she had kept with her ever since. "When I have children," he said, "I will never be able to smell my baby." He was 32 years old. He had 4 years left. He did not know about the brain damage that was already beginning to alter him from the inside out, did not know about the custody battle that was coming, or the tabloids, or the injunction, or the phone call at 5 in the morning that would arrive at the end of everything. He only knew in that moment that he had lost something irreplaceable, and that somewhere in a future he could not yet see, there would be a child, and he would not be able to do the simple animal thing of pressing his face into their hair and knowing them by their smell.
Tiger Lily Hutchence Geldof is expecting her first child. She will know what her baby smells like. Her father would have given anything for that.